Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel webinar, How Can We Prepare Our Communities and Businesses for a Zero Emissions Vehicle Future? My name's Alyssa, and I work for Bow Valley Climate Action Society based on Treaty 7 territory. BVCA, Bow Valley Climate Action Society, is a nonprofit organization that seeks to galvanize community action on climate change, focusing primarily on the topics of buildings, transportation, and advocacy. And this webinar is part of a series of programs, resources, and events that we're putting on as part of our Envisioning and Preparing for a Low Carbon Future project, which has been made possible by our gracious funders that you'll see at the bottom right of the screen, the Town of Banff, the Banff Canmore Community Foundation, and the Town of Canmore. So a big thank you to them. So we have a really exciting lineup of panelists today who will be able to highlight the opportunities to innovate and take action towards preparing for a zero emissions vehicle future in the Bow Valley. And we're also equally excited to be having everyone join us today. So as you join the webinar, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat and maybe say where you're calling in from as well. Now, before I pass it over to our moderator, I just want to note that this webinar is being recorded. So if you have to hop off at any stage, that's no problem at all. You can check our Facebook page, the BVCA Facebook page, this afternoon, and we'll make sure we have the recording up there. And I'll post the link to the BVCA Facebook in the chat in just a moment. And the other thing to note is that we do encourage you to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen here, and do that at any point throughout this webinar. And hopefully we'll be able to get to all of your questions. So without further ado, I would like to pass it over to the moderator of our event, William York. William has served on the board of directors of the Electric Vehicle Association of Alberta since 2017. He has a degree in electrical engineering and has worked in the electric utility industry for nearly a decade. He currently works as an electric vehicle specialist for Atco Electric, and throughout his career, William has actually installed nearly half of the EV fast charging infrastructure in the province of Alberta. So that's all from me. Over to you, William.
Thank you, Alyssa, for that introduction. So today's topic, as Alyssa said, is how can we prepare our communities and businesses for a zero-emission vehicle future? And many of us believe that it is a foregone conclusion that all vehicles by some date in the future will be electric. If you pay attention to global automakers, they are all commencing plans to electrify their fleets, and many are ceasing research and development on internal combustion engine technologies. If you look at the supply chains, they are all pivoting to electrification. There are many mining projects spurring up all over the globe to meet electric vehicle demand, and governments are instituting policies to phase out gas vehicles. So this topic is quite appropriate for developers, municipal leaders, and citizens of the Bow Valley. I just want to take a minute and introduce the topic of EV readiness and EV capability so that folks on the call know what we're talking about. So the concept comes about because electric vehicles are not widespread at the moment, but we are building buildings, facilities, homes, and facilities that should take into account widespread EV ownership. So EV capable means that you have installed an electric panel with capacity, electrical capacity, and a dedicated branch circuit and continuous raceway from the panel to the future EV parking spot. EV ready means you've installed the electrical panel with capacity and the raceway and cable and the receptacle capable of charging an electric vehicle at 240 volts. And EV installed means that that receptacle is now replaced with a charging station that's capable of charging an EV. I'll now introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Yi-Chao Chen, who is a sustainable infrastructure engineer with the City of Calgary. Yi-Chao is a sustainability professional with a decade of experience in green building practices, energy modeling and energy management, distributed renewable energy systems, and climate mitigation resilience strategies in infrastructure. With her current role at the City of Calgary, she has been involved in a number of EV charging infrastructure projects, including public chargers at transit locations and recreation centers, light, medium duty fleet charging, electric refuse EV charging, and EV readiness in sustainable new construction. Next up is Michael Simone. Michael is a manager of operations engineering with Fortis. He graduated with a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Windsor in 2005. He has been working at Fortis Alberta since 2006 with various engineering roles, including more recently senior protection and control engineer. He is also a proud owner of a Tesla Model 3 and looking at technical opportunities to enable more transportation electrification in Alberta. Welcome, Michael. Next up, we have Waverly Birch. She is a local EV owner and activist, and she has a awesome Instagram account handle at 20together. Waverly is an ecologist and registered professional planner in her professional life, but is joining this event as an EV owner and climate advocate. When she got her first EV last year, she saw it as an opportunity to share the experience and encourage others to take the leap if possible. She now combines her professional and personal knowledge to share this experience through a sustainability social media page that she co-manages with another science-minded friend. So you can find her at Instagram with the handle at 20together. And finally, Megan Lohman, who I know through my professional circles. Megan is the project manager of Peaks to Prairies, a charging station project that actually brought charging stations to the Bow Valley at Canmore and Bears Pub. Megan works strategically with communities to identify high impact climate opportunities in the sectors of electric mobility, high performance building, and waste diversion. Recently, she managed the Peaks to Prairies EV network in Southern Alberta, addressing a significant gap in fast charging infrastructure in the province. So welcome to all our panelists. So I have some set questions for the panelists to discuss. Once we get through those questions, there will be time for a Q&A period. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat. And with that, I'll get going. So the first topic is home charging is obviously a high priority in terms of enabling EV ownership. I consider it to be one of the highest reasons to purchase an electric vehicle. Residential EV ready typically assumes AC level 2 chargers are installed. What are the impediments to getting new and existing Bow Valley single and multifamily homes EV ready, and how can these be overcome? And I'm going to kick this question over to Michael first for a high level overview of what residential EV charging looks like.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I guess to kind of speak at it as kind of at a high level between the two, there's obviously two large differences between your single family home residential charging and if you live in a condo, what that charging infrastructure looks like. And there's definitely large differences between what those requirements are going to look like, and potentially the infrastructure constraints from the utility side of making sure that when somebody purchases a new vehicle, that the infrastructure that's in place kind of meets the demand requirements kind of for that future. So when you look at the two, like they're definitely two separate situations. And I'll focus more on the single phase home or the single residential homes, but for the condos and stuff like that, it really comes down to the facility owners to be able to work with the condos associations and stuff like that to find a way to work with the residents to get the infrastructure to make ready. And from the utilities perspective, the constraints, they really depend on what that new demand is going to be. But like speaking from like some experience on the utility side for the single home facilities, It really depends on what that looks like. And if you have a transformer outside of your house, and then you have 12 or 20 different houses kind of connected to that same transformer, when you start adding different EVs, the limitations of that transformer are something to consider, as well as the limitations of the cables that are in the ground. So looking for stuff that's historically been into the ground, it can be like there's going to be some constraints in the future of what that looks like in terms of the demand on the transformer versus the I don't want to get too technical, but the voltage drop or the level of power quality, I guess, in that residential network when you start adding more and more EVs. And so I think there's a lot to kind of talk about when it comes to making sure that when new facilities are built, you're looking at that kind of make-ready approach, so you don't have to kind of go back and worry about retrofitting new cables that have to go into the ground, or putting in a new transformer, because as soon as you kind of dig into the ground, especially in the Canmore and Banff areas, it can get really expensive if you start have to hydrovac trenches and stuff like that for hundreds of meters. So it's I think making sure that I don't want to get into the other kind of questions around policy and stuff like that, but making sure that kind of what we plan for the future meets that level of demand that we expect for electric vehicles. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Michael. I want to now kick it over to Waverly, because as I understand it, you live in a multi-unit residential building and you've kind of navigated this already as an electric vehicle owner. So I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, William. So I think that Michael laid out some really good points there that tie into both the single family and multi-urban residential type buildings, but it's something that, especially in the Bow Valley, is going to be of concern for many people, because we have a very dense urban form in general. More affordable houses are generally condos. I myself live in a stacked townhouse, so we have commercial parking out front. I can use it at night, and then underground residential parking and so on. And so not really access to like a porch, like a typical house, kind of do, but had to get a little creative. And so when I went to look for an EV, or I went to look to replace my old car that I thought was probably going to start to cost me a lot of money soon, I wanted an EV, but it required a lot of sort of flexibility and creativity. And I think that that's something that a lot of people get scared off by. It's really when it comes to the retrofits, right? Because most really new condo buildings are taking this into consideration. A lot of municipalities, although not in the Bow Valley as far as I know, do have requirements around electric vehicle charging in new builds, but it's where the retrofits come in, where we have a big obstacle to get over. So I think that one thing, I guess if I start at what people can do about this, is the first thing I did that really, really helped was to just find a car that you can borrow. A lot of dealers will give them to you for a set amount of time. There's a place in Calgary called Go Electric, and they'll give you a car for 3 days. And I was absolutely petrified about where I was going to charge this thing. I was convinced that I would get stranded, and I figured out like, oh, you know what, actually at night I could plug into my porch, or nearby there's a level 3 charger, which is the faster chargers that'll like text me when it's done charging, and I can just walk over and get it. So there's a lot of flexibility, but then for longer term solutions, I think it's really important to, like has been alluded to get on condo boards and to try to come up with solutions. And I think it's important for people to keep in mind that that solution might not just be, having a level 2 charger at every single person's spot. We've looked at that, or even every other spot in our parking, and it would be sort of technically difficult, very expensive with electrical capacity, just expensive because they'd have to be metered chargers, which tend to cost 4 times as much as non-metered chargers. So what's working for us right now is to actually have just a level 1 like household outlet that we plug into. There's a fee that goes to the condo corporation, and you can realistically install those at like pretty much everyone's charging spots with the current capacity. And then having flexibility again to put something maybe outside where people can access it in the evening and share the charging more so, or look to your community and where there might be some sort of central area, like near me, there's the shops of Canmore where I can go fast charge. So really for retrofits, they're difficult, but you can get around them. Try to be flexible, be creative, and just try it out.
Awesome. And it sounds like there's not a one size fits all approach to condos and condo boards, that you really have to work with them to kind of come up with a solution that works.
Yeah, and finding a solution that works for everyone, I've found, is really key. Like I can plug into the one, outlet near me maybe, but is that going to work for everyone? So getting down to the policy level of your condo bylaws and so on, and making sure that it's not just for one owner, but for everyone.
Right. What about folks without garages or a means of to charge at home? The industry has coined this term garage orphan, and I'm really curious to get Megan Lohman's opinion on this subject for folks that can't even rely on a condo board or a garage to park at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And it's true, there's going to be a transition period by which, these multi-unit residentials and new home policies enacted to ensure that our buildings are future-proofed. But that's where the public charging network comes in, and where local government leadership on identifying collaborative opportunities in their communities can be really powerful to fill those gaps. So kind of two pieces there. The public charging network, that's definitely from a kind of cold climate, rural, broad regional perspective, so critical to get fast charging and level 2 infrastructure across our small communities to provide that reliable access to charging between communities. And then within communities, what we're starting to kind of talk with local governments about, talk with communities about, is the concept of identifying strategic charging hub locations for the community that can integrate public, workplace, commercial charging access, and ideally also alleviate concerns around garage orphans. So in my ideal scenario, there would be a neighborhood perhaps with multi-unit residential or homes without off-street parking that are maybe situated close to a school or a municipal facility where there's not a lot of demand for parking overnight. So could you in those scenarios look at public charging, permitted charging, overnight for local residents that don't have access to at-home charging, and then daytime use by the workplace or commercial or institutional site host. These are kind of the creative solutions that I think we're going to have to start to consider. And the nice thing about that, about leveraging different types of use at different times of day, is that you optimize the number of charging events on the unit, and get a quicker payback on your investment for the infrastructure. So just a few ideas to seed, I think, for any of the local governments that are on the call or commercial institutional partners.
I really like that answer, Megan, because it addresses both the business owner concern of making money and the user concern of finding a place to charge. I think we should maybe finish off this question by talking to Yi Chow about her thoughts, being a City of Calgary employee, on the cost of retrofits versus new builds, and what does that look like? What does the policy look like there? And yeah, your opinion on this topic.
Yeah, for sure. So for new builds, obviously retrofit new builds, and the other panelists definitely have alluded onto, they're very different beasts. For retrofit, it's typically more expensive, as well as just technically being lesser feasible to do sometimes. And oftentimes we don't put stress on demand management more. And also sometimes there's energy retrofit that can be done in the building. For example, lighting retrofit that can reduce the demand of the existing building, that can free up some energy loads potentially for EV charging. Also, because when EV chargers are tied to a commercial or residential building or MURBs, in that case, there is potential for behavioral changes that you don't have all the energy intensive load happening at the same time. In single family homes, that's similar to maybe you don't run the dryer while you're charging for EV. That could potentially reduce that retrofit cost of what kind of transformer, what kind of electrical capacity you'll need to do the same kind of charging for your EV driving habits. In terms of new build, there is some policy that is becoming more ubiquitous on EV readiness, especially for multi-unit residential buildings. So sometimes it's conduit in place, sometimes it's having that extra capacity in the electrical panels. But oftentimes we're also looking for something along the line of upgradability. Can you, in the future, upgrade the transformer, upgrade certain electrical future-proofing capacity to integrate EV charging? And we're seeing more and more renewable systems onto especially single family homes, sometimes even multi-unit residential. So that will change the demand curve quite significantly in terms of a typical residential behavior. So to manage that, having the smart charger and having that sort of two-way street, sometimes vehicle to grid, to be able to monitor or moderate those behavior could potentially lower the cost in terms of hardware for new build as well as retrofit.
Great. Moving on, what can business owners, commercial developers do to be EV ready? And what are the opportunities for business owners and commercial developers? And I think, Megan, you've kind of already addressed this, but can you expand on that topic, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's tons of opportunity here because, you know, from our perspective of developing regional and inter-community connectivity, the emphasis really in the Peaks to Prairies example and what we're forging in Northwest Alberta right now as well is around tourism and economic development. There is a case to be made for commercial sector to host stations. You've got a dedicated audience for, you know, maybe half an hour to an hour if it's a fast charger, and much longer if it's a level 2. I'm actually calling in from the Nanton Public Library because my vehicle is parked just a block over at the public fast charger here. I'm en route to Calgary, and you know, very convenient to come here and either, you know, check out a new location or spend money in a community. So from the commercial perspective, of course, there's considerations to be made about the type of infrastructure that's appropriate for your location, as well as the cost of that infrastructure. Level 2 being a much lower financial barrier to entry in terms of the ownership and operations costs, and fast charging being significantly more. But you've got an attentive audience for a set amount of time when folks are coming to charge. And if you're a site host that's conveniently located, has an amenity or a service to offer, there's huge opportunity. And that's why you'll see, for example, in Canmore, you know, the Atco site, the Peaks to Prairie site is right downtown, one half a block from the main street. Shops of Canmore, Electrify Canada, conveniently located where there's access to coffee shops right off the main highway access there. So you'll start to see, you know, the ideal locations for that type of charging, where you're going to optimize the charging sessions.
And I think you mentioned to me that we're starting to see some policies come out in Surrey. I think that you mentioned to me that requirement. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, there's only a couple, well, Surrey is the one that has adopted a bylaw that requires that every new gas station that's constructed provide alternative fuel supply. So whether it's EV charging or, you know, hydrogen or something like that. So that's actually written in that no new gas station can be constructed without that option. So there is a policy mechanism that can be implemented. We've seen a couple cases where, unfortunately, that, you know, wasn't the case. Kelowna, for example, just had a massive Costco gas bar installed and no EV charging and no EV readiness. And I think that that's a big missed opportunity. So for local governments to consider how to, implement that EV readiness requirement that Yichao spoke of as well is critical.
Waverly, I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the non-EV related considerations here. You know, snow clearing, for example. Like, what as an EV owner do you want to see for EV readiness?
Yeah, that's a good example and prompt there. So my partner and I drove across Canada at Christmas in our EV, sort of medium priced, it's a Hyundai Kona. And it's doable, it's possible, I'm still here. But what we found was along the way, you'd have, you know, a huge snowstorm and absolutely everything would be cleared except for the electric car station at your Petrocan or something like that. So you'd be kind of like plowing your own way in. So that's definitely one. For general EV readiness, I think Megan's made some really good points around where that's located, the amenities around the actual stations. I, for one, would really love to see chargers at places in Canmore, like Elevation Place, where, you know, my car could be plugged in while I'm climbing, or I don't know if it would be possible at like a dog park or something. Those are a bit further away, but areas like grocery stores are a really key one where you can sort of passively charge while you go about your activities. I think those things make it really feasible for the majority of the population to have an electric car, even if they don't have a charger at home at all, or only have, you know, a level 1 plug-in like I realistically have right now. So I think those types of things, thinking about how it can be more passive, is what's really going to get us there, especially in a place like Canmore.
Yeah, completely agree. I think some of the amenities that you see at gas stations need to be at charging locations, essentially. So windshield wiper stations, garbage cans, you know, all those sorts of things. Otherwise, you see garbage on the ground. Michael, I want to take this question to you to get the kind of utility perspective of EV readiness and what developers and municipalities and owners should be considering.
I was going to actually take my hat off to be like more of the, you know, on the consumer side of things. I kind of still look at things as a, you know, you really want to have, like, there's two crucial things, or actually three crucial components: is your home charging, your kind of on route charging, which is your level 3 charging. And then I really love to see kind of this level 2 destination charging. So if I'm going to Canmore, I like, from a consumer's perspective, if the facility, or if I, you know, want to go to a hotel, or if I want to go somewhere, I'm going to be staying for long hours. You know, if there is one place that has EV chargers, I'm probably going to book at that place. So from a you know, an incentive to go to a certain area, you know, and be yeah, to incentivize the kind of, I guess whoever is, set up that charger. You know, it's either a hotel, or if it's a location I'm going to be at for 4 hours. You know, if I'm skiing or something like that, I could be there for the day. You know, it's something that, you know, I'm going to look at first before I even, you know, go out to travel. And so, like, from a utility perspective, I think I didn't really have too much to say, because I've already kind of talked about kind of the conditions around, you know, level 2 is fairly cheap. If you're, you know, either, you know, an employer looking to set up, you know, 10 or, you know, 5 to 10 level 2 chargers at your you know, your work location. But if you're, you know, hotel, or you know, a ski resort or anything like that, and I think, you know, going down that level 3 charger route is, I think, better suited for those, you know, traveling corridors. But, you know, if you want people to go to your facility or go to your ski resort or hotel, like, that's the first thing that I'm looking at. If I want to go to Vulcan and stay there for the night, I'm going to be concerned maybe a little bit. If I go to Waterton, I know there's maybe a select amount of chargers. And Canmore, kind of the same thing. I know there's level 3 chargers that are popping up, but I don't know exactly how many level 2 chargers there are. And so I think that's a great incentive as a consumer, that I'm going to go to those locations.
So Michael, if somebody who in Canmore would let's say a commercial developer, or even the municipality, would like to think about installing a bank of level 2 chargers or level 3 chargers, how would they engage Fortis, and what kind of considerations would they want to have when they do that engagement with Fortis?
Right, good question. Yeah, there's funding that I think everybody is aware of that's popping up right now for that specific thing. And I think the questions that you need to kind of raise are, how much additional load is one of these chargers gonna at a cost or whatever for that transformer that you have at your location. So a lot of these times, these level 2 chargers, you get them and they're 7 kilowatts, or they're basically 7 to 8 kilowatts. And as long as you're kind of maintaining, as long as you're going under the rating of your transformer, and again, I don't want to get too technical here, that'll kind of give you an idea of what that cost would be just to upgrade X amount of stalls to these level 2 chargers. As soon as you start going, adding more and more, and you start exceeding certain, basically the loading limits of the transformer at your location, then you start having to look at the utility or somebody replacing assets and stuff like that, and it gets really costly. So I think there probably is a lot of room to kind of spark a few chargers before, and I don't know what that would look like without having maybe the electrician kind of looking at each location and kind of determining what the load levels are for a level 2 charger. But yeah.
Speaking for Atco, and I imagine it works similar to Fortis, is that we're willing as your utility provider to work with you to help you navigate it, because we understand that it's kind of a new technology and a new, it's just new completely. I wanted to get Yichao's any last thoughts on this topic before we move on to the next and final question.
Yeah, maybe it's more of a bit of a summary of what everybody said as well. So there is definitely changes needed from the driver's behavior. Perhaps as an EV owner, you no longer are driving through every gas station on the cross-Canada trip. You have to plan your stops, your charging accordingly. And same thing from the business perspective. You're essentially identifying good locations such as restaurants, gyms, malls, hotels as well, places that people will be parking that is good for destination charging. Similar in the city of Calgary, we've identified, for example, park and ride locations where people go to take the train, park their car for the day, or go to the rec center, park there for a few hours. Those are great locations for level 2 charging stations. And sometimes there's alternate for your fleet to charge. For example, at the transit center, the public can go charge during the day because they'll likely be parked there, but no one's there at night. So your fleet vehicle, which may be EVs, can potentially use those stalls at night. So there's definitely some sharing opportunities there. And lastly, from that utility point of view, in Calgary, we work at MX, and we do identify some of the low-cost locations, especially when it comes to level 3 charging, because understanding the hardware cost is so significant when you need to bring significant capacity. Identifying where those locations that's close to supplies to transformers are huge when you're trying to do corridor or fast charging. And lastly, there's that demand sort of matching. When you have a location that's primarily used for the day, perhaps solar panels over the parking areas, shading can be a good opportunity to reduce that demand peak during the day. So there's definitely opportunities that can be explored from all sides, not just from the drivers, but also from the policymaker, utility, and the restaurants or commercial owners.
Great answer. And I think that dovetails nicely into the final question, which is, what are the policy options decision makers need to consider related to community charging? And I apologize, Yichao, but I think you are the perfect person to answer this. So I'm going to give the baton over to you again.
No problem. So from the policy point of view, I think we talked about earlier, there should be for new builds, because we're building for 75, 50 years into the future, those infrastructure need to have some readiness when it comes to renewables, EVs, so the demand management, just so that we don't have to upgrade infrastructure relatively short into the future. I guess secondly, we can allude to currently in Alberta, we're not allowed to charge for electricity or kilowatt hour in that sense. Typically, locations will only be allowed to charge for the hour, similar to parking. That may be okay when it's a level 2 charger or relatively sort of low rate charger. But when it comes to level 3 or fast chargers, you're not comparing apples to apples if you're charging the driver by the hour. So that potentially needs some policy and AUC amendments in order for essentially businesses to be able to charge somebody for the actual kilowatt hour consumed, not just for the hour there. And lastly, there probably should be some policy, I guess, platform for what's needed in the charger. We're seeing some quote unquote dumb chargers versus the smart chargers that's on the market. They have different costs, and some of them may have vehicle to grid capacity. Some of them don't. Some of them may have revenue styles or the metering system. Some of them don't. What is the minimum requirements that you'll need for a charger today and potentially to be able to upgrade to a certain minimum standard in the future? All of those should be considered when we are rolling out electric vehicle charging stations.
A great answer that I expected from you. So thank you for that. Waverly, I want to kick this over to you from the owner's perspective. I bet you have some, thoughts on policies you'd like to see as a result of, I want to keep it positive, but bad experiences visiting public charging stations.
Yeah, as that discussion was happening there, I was definitely thinking of policy from a planning perspective also. Very much an environmental planner, not a municipal planner. However, something that I think that's probably doesn't come up as often, but should be discussed is with like a huge expansion of infrastructure. We need to keep in mind that we're in, both a climate and biodiversity crisis. So when we're thinking of where to put infrastructure, if we're going to like create EV charging stations and they're going to be on the edge of town like a gas station might be, it's really important to consider both of those sides of it for the policy piece, for the land use planning piece. So that's less so from the owner's perspective, more from everyday work. But with from an owner's perspective, with frustrations of using infrastructure, that was the sort of yeah, I think
I was thinking more so the icing issue.
Okay, understood. So if people don't on the call don't know what icing is, it's when a non-electric vehicle ends up parked in an electric vehicle stall, or when an electric vehicle is not charging but is parked in an electric vehicle stall. And I've actually noticed that in Canmore specifically, people seem to be pretty good about this until you get somewhere like a crowded trailhead. There's some areas in Banff that have chargers at the trailheads, and I've had to sort of, snake a cord around someone's car to get to it. But for this one, it's, really an enforcement piece, really a piece around community education. I've noticed that a lot of the time when there's stalls that are really well demarcated, they're painted green, they say EV in them, it's a little harder to ignore unless you really just hate electric cars. So having things like that make it really clear to non-EV drivers that they should not be parking there are really important, I think.
Yeah, agreed. And it would be the same as blocking a gas station pump, right? Like this is critical infrastructure for EV drivers. So it needs to be 100% accessible at all times, unless someone else is using it. I think, Megan, your experience on Peaks to Prairies probably provides a unique perspective on what policy you need to see from an installer's point of view. So would love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I was just thinking about all the layers of agreements. When you go into as a local government or a site host, if you're enabling a fast charging infrastructure that's owned and operated by an external party, there are layers of agreements. And we actually found, confusion, to be honest, at some local government levels where, does this count as a building? Do we need a building permit? What are the, is this a license, like a business license that's required? So it is something that we had to work through, the various interpretations of local governments and what their role was to enable EV charging. And I saw the question there around, what is the role of municipalities when it comes to enabling this type of infrastructure when, we don't do the same for gas stations in terms of ownership by local governments and enabling policy. But we are, as we really said, we're in response to a climate crisis, and it's an opportunity to look at EV charging as more than the delivery of a fuel, as much as it is the delivery of a service for tourism and economic benefit. So I'd love to see us work toward consistent policy around and enabling policy for public charging, for home and multi-unit residential charging. And you know, when it comes to new construction of commercial and residential development, like we've all mentioned, EV readiness policy is critical. It's the cheapest way to get to future-proof these buildings. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. You ended right at 12:40, which means we're going to audience questions. So the first one that I saw, and I see Megan's already answered it, but I think it's good pitch to the rest of the panel, comes from Brian Kinsey. And he says, what is a reasonable assumption for the number of units in a new multifamily residential or single family residential development for the percentage of units needing access to a level 2 charger? Considering the role of the AUC in regulating facilities design, what can municipalities do in order to ensure that this minimum level of service is being provided in new communities? And I am wondering does anyone want to grab that question? Anyone have an answer at the tip of their tongue? Michael, it sounds like you do.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, right? Because especially at the single home level, you really don't know. And you know, there's, you know, current trends and predictions, and, you know, a lot of people, especially with the oil, you know, oil prices being, you know, where they're at, we could definitely see a much faster rate of penetration of electric vehicles into, you know, residential areas, multi-unit, like condos and stuff like that. I think it's also a difficult thing to answer because, like Megan was saying before, you know, if we wanted to, you know, add level 2 chargers to everybody's unit, it would be extremely costly and might not be necessary. You know, there's demand side charging or demand side management where you could potentially utilize something like that within like an area like that. But to answer your question, I don't think there is an answer.
Does anyone want to enhance that thinking that Michael provided or offer a different opinion?
It's a really good question. And I've actually seen a couple studies that City of Calgary and Edmonton has commissioned about multi-unit residential charging infrastructure specifically. Basically, there's an inflection point if you do say 10% EV ready. Going forward, this is the amount of cost, but once you exceed a certain point, the curve goes up quite exponentially because of the infrastructure that's needed. So going in, if you do 100% EV ready, no one's gonna, or no developer in their right mind is going to take that up. There should be a reasonable minimum requirement. Currently, City of Calgary is saying 10% for city-owned facilities. That is not a blanket requirement for the developers in residential sector, but this may be a starting point. It really depends on the rate of EV adoption and how much are we willing to shell out in terms of capital cost on day one to prepare for the future. So yes, there should be a minimum requirement. It's not 100%. However, what that is depends on maybe a little too many factors.
Yeah, it feels like, and maybe it's inappropriate for a moderator to comment, but I'm just going to say that in the single family scenario, I could see there being, I think we need a one-to-one relationship with the charger and the home in single family homes. With MURBs, it probably doesn't need to be one-to-one. There needs to be a swapping system of some sort or a scheduling system of some sort, because one-to-one, as Yichao said, the costs just start to explode and the requirement isn't really there. As an EV driver myself, when I plug in, I'm recharged within an hour and my car is connected to a charging station for 16, sometimes longer hours. So Waverly, you were probably going to say something like that, but I just wanted to chime in on the matter. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really good points. I was just going to say, I don't think it needs to be one-to-one. I think, you know, it would even probably be excessive in the multi-residential building that I live in to have it be, you know, that there's one in between every 2 stalls so that those 2 people could switch, because they're going to realistically use it for how long in a week. So I think having zones with faster charging, just from my own personal perspective of like living in one of these situations, seems to be really helpful. And if that can be established during a build, if that can be somewhere like with my building where we think that that might really work outside, then that's great. Or if there's a part of your building where there's guest parking type thing, and you could have like a charging zone, that might work really well.
Yeah, or it doesn't have to be a level 2 charger. It could be a level 3 for the entire building to use, right? Just like the laundry room is a shared laundry room for.
Yeah. Well, in the buildings that have like the level 1 block heater spots, that's awesome. I would love to live in one of those.
Yeah, absolutely, because that could work for a lot of your daily driving. The next question that comes to us is, and this was answered by Waverly, but I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on it more. So Shannon Ripley says, our neighborhood in Canmore was built around 1992. A neighbor recently explored how they could install EV charging infrastructure at their home, and they found out it would cost $15,000 to bring adequate electrical cable from the transformer to their house, because EVs were not contemplated when the neighborhood was built. How does this cost compare with the cost of building new neighborhoods EV ready? And I think, Michael, you're a perfect person to answer the difference in like the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But I'd also like to get your comment on like, is a service upgrade necessary, or do people have alternatives like charging at a lower amperage, for instance? So
yeah, no, it's a great question. And, there's already some comments on, the demand requirements for charging as well. And I think that maybe, a lot of consumers don't understand that they can curtail charging at the facility. So I think in some cases, it really depends, when you request kind of an upgrade in your service, you've really got to ask yourself, do I really need to upgrade my service? Which is going to trigger potentially a utility review to look at that, the increase in demand. So, $15,000 could be mitigated by potentially just having some load side demand management on your side by not charging at 48 amps, or, some consumers or customers that call in want to install an 80 amp charger at their house. And I'm like, it's going to cost, a bunch of money in upgrades if you really want to go down this route. Or, you can, potentially use level 3 charging when you really need it, and lower your amperage down to 32 amps, and if you really need to, lower it down to 15, 20 amps, or whatever doesn't exceed the panel rating at your house. And I think you need to really take both of those into consideration as a somebody who works for a utility and somebody who owns an EV. I make sure that my Tesla or my car charges kind of at midnight, because I have a 100 amp panel at my house. And so I kind of manage it like that. But some people, when they go to their electrician, they expand and say they want AC, they want a hot tub and an electric vehicle, and then that triggers that you need a 200 amp panel, especially for existing infrastructure. But looking forward, it's a lot cheaper to make sure that you spend a little bit like today, so you kind of future-proof tomorrow. So when somebody, when it gets, this province is getting warmer, when somebody wants to install an AC and add on an electric vehicle, we're kind of already accommodating that. So,
yeah, I think I don't want to speak for Fortis, but Atco recently did this cost exercise, and we found that the cost of upgrading from a 100 amp to a 200 amp when the neighborhood is being built was dimes on the dollar in terms of retrofit. Like, from a cost perspective, if you assume that EVs will be everywhere, it made absolute sense to do. So I'll leave it at that. There was a question that kind of dovetails into this that we can quickly comment on from Glenn Archer, talking about, I don't think the CEC will allow for behavioral changes. If a potential load is installed, it must be accounted for. I actually do have a little bit of knowledge on this topic from my role. And I do know that there are charge controllers made by different manufacturers. Leviton is one of them, that you can put an EV charging station on. It'll monitor your main panel to see if it's heavily loaded. And if it is, it will shut off the EV charging station and wait for that capacity to return in the panel. And the CEC does allow for this device, and it basically circumvents the calculations, the loading calculations. So very quickly, we just have a minute before we switch to the next question. I I guess I'll pass this back to Michael. Are you aware of that as well? And do you have any comments on Glenn's question?
No, I agree. There are devices exactly like you're saying that allow you to kind of manage load. But in terms of like we don't, like as a utility, we don't add all the loads up in a house and say that's going to be the demand. We have a kind of a diversity factor that we take into consideration, that things are going to be used at different times of the day, and so there's a percentage decrease on that as well. That's taken into account. Yeah, that is one of the other options for to kind of mitigate that, is what they to shut down the load.
Yeah. So Glenn, there are options. Okay, just because I know her, I'm going to give her some love. So Amy Fournier has posed 2 questions to the panel. Her first question is, does Fortis and Atco already have accessibility guidance for municipalities and developers on how to make new developments and neighborhoods EV ready? I'll let you take it first, Michael.
That's like a difficult question, because we can't necessarily set like we really have to base it on what the expected load is going to be for a certain area. And if the municipalities, we really rely on their direction as well to set the expectation for what the people that are moving into that area are going to demand. And some of those are moving towards 200 amp panels to accommodate like the what we see in additional load increases. And so we like maybe I can read the question again. But yeah, it's we have our what our standards are, but we don't necessarily want to dictate what needs to be installed. We really want that to come from the different areas. So, but we do see like we don't necessarily want to go back and start replacing things 5 years down the road because we didn't accommodate for the load. So it's 2 sides of the story there.
Yeah, I would say from ATCO's perspective, we are looking into this, and we're starting with first principles, which is our engineering study of it. So we have to understand what the system looks like after a certain percentage of adoption, and see what changing to a higher service size like 200 amp services would do. And I'll leave it at that. Amy's second question is, do any Alberta municipalities have requirements for EV readiness in new construction? And I think Yichao probably knows the answer.
Yeah, I meant to type it out. So for City of Calgary, we have a requirement for all new city-owned or funded facilities. 10% of the charging stalls needs to be EV ready. That applies to any, including affordable housing or civic partner facilities such as libraries, etc. But for Edmonton, I was just doing a quick Googling because they did update their climate resilient building requirements. They don't have a blanket EV ready requirement, but because their buildings typically pursue LEED, and one of the credits being EV ready or having the EV stalls in place, a lot of their buildings do. I can't speak to the rest of the Alberta municipalities. If anybody else knows, feel free.
I was just going to put in the link to the most recent one in Western Canada, not Alberta specifically, but Kamloops just adopted their EV ready neighborhood bylaw that has lots of detail that you could copy and paste perhaps. I'll just link it in your answer as well. And just with all of these conversations around EV readiness, I just want to reiterate something that was mentioned like 45 minutes ago around load management and smart metering and vehicle to grid, because these are the elements that are going to increasingly come into play as new vehicles have that capability. So the Ford F-150 Lightning being personally the most exciting one from a vehicle to grid and kind of battery on wheels opportunity. So it's not just about having an electrified outlet to then put a dumb charger on, but to make sure that there's some sort of language or direction or information for residents and builders to encourage smart technology whenever possible so that you're enabling future opportunity for that load management capabilities.
Awesome answer. Okay, that should do it for questions. Apologies to folks that posed questions and didn't get them answered. I hope we can address them in the chat as we move on to the closing thoughts. So I wanted to get everyone's closing thoughts for the municipal leaders and the commercial developers that are on the call today. And I guess I will start with Megan.
I was just typing to Shannon to her question there, but
Okay.
I think for me, yeah, it is about really like looking into the future. What is the ideal, low carbon community from a whole? So we're talking about EVs today, as Shannon mentioned, but that was exactly on my mind, is that we're also transitioning to heat pumps, for example, for more efficient cooling systems as our climate warms. There's all sorts of technologies, smart lighting and smart thermostats and things you can control from your phone. So how are we enabling these opportunities to also better manage the demand in our community so that we're not at the same time perpetuating energy poverty situations? So keeping that kind of broader vision in mind, but thinking about how to address some of these other issues and challenges that are sure to arise as we continue to build low carbon communities.
Nice. And I like the lens you framed it up with earlier about climate leadership. I mean, yeah, you're right that municipalities, there's not a great precedent for them getting involved in gas stations, for instance, but it's about that climate leadership lens. Waverly, your thoughts.
Sure. Just to tie in on the municipal leadership side of it, I think, on various environmental topics, we see that local action is extremely effective. We have a lot of jurisdiction over what happens at a broader scale just by changing things locally. So municipal leadership is definitely important. We've talked a lot about, different constraints to EVs specifically today. And I think for me, a lot of this around any climate issue, but especially around climate action, it really comes down to your mindset and being able to maintain the flexibility, creativity, and just like not letting yourself get stuck. So I think this comes down to everyday community members who are looking at getting an EV, to municipal decision makers where something might just seem to be really difficult. You might not be able to get over that hurdle. But I find that once you set the wheels in motion there are lots of solutions. And if you maintain that flexibility, we'll probably get to them.
Michael.
I mean, I think like there's I guess two things to look at or to kind of to take away is the consumer or like somebody who wants to install charging at their facility really needs to consider kind of what demand side management can do for them before they have to reach out and there being extensive upgrades kind of like on the utility side of things. So making sure that either consumer, somebody at their house, really know what you want before you want to reach out and upgrade your panel, understand how you can manage load and everything like that. We talked about that, but also looking forward to the taking that into account, looking into the future when you're building things that are new, to take into account that as we 5-10 years down the road, I think they're both going to be very important. That infrastructure upgrades are going to be required, but we do need to manage that with load side management to ensure that everything is really optimized, especially cost.
Awesome. And last but not least, Yichao.
I want to thank everybody. Those are really great perspectives, and they're probably highlights. What I want to say is that it takes everyone. It takes policymakers, regulators, grid, utility providers, but also consumers and producers. Maybe we should call it prosumers, to actually come together to get this EV ready future in place. And in a way, EV is only a piece of the sustainability. we're not going to essentially decarbonize our way out of, I guess, the current situation using single passenger vehicles. It is still a piece. Hopefully the inconvenience in the way of EV charging is making us drive less, not because of the inconvenience that we're staying with gas vehicles. So all of that is to say that electric vehicle charging is a barrier, but it's also a huge opportunity that can bring all the players together. And if we do it right, a lot of the prosumers, as Michael has mentioned, the demand management side is going to be huge. It's not just about adding the capacity, it's really about managing it and potentially using renewables to offset and smooth out the curves.
And I guess, no, we don't have time for my closing thoughts. So we'll go to Alyssa.
Thank you so much, William, for moderating, and to all of our panelists. Just want to quickly wrap up here with that big thank you to everyone. I'm going to share my screen super quickly with a few things to share. One, as I put in the chat, there's an event feedback form, and if you fill it out, you'll be entered to win a $25 gift certificate. This really just helps us to prepare for future events, so we'd really appreciate that. And next week at 7:30 p.m. Wednesday, we have another panel event, which is how can we reduce our building emissions together? So we'll be switching from the transportation lens to the buildings lens, and we're very excited about that. You can find out more information on our Facebook page, which is also where we're going to be posting the recording for this session. And with that, right on time, I will say thank you to everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.